Running a criminal syndicate, people assumed, required two things: money and brutality. What it actually required was judgment, and judgment required sleep. Falcone had not slept properly in 8 months. Nobody in his organization was willing to say so, because the men around him were afraid of him, and fear was a very effective substitute for honesty. Darby Stokes was not afraid of him. She was, however, very much afraid of the $6,000 she still owed his organization. That was how she ended up on the 14th floor of Redmond Holdings at 11 o'clock at night, auditing accounts that didn't quite add up the way clean accounts were supposed to. She'd been hired through a staffing agency, nighttime auditor, 3 months, competitive rate. She didn't ask questions about who owned Redmond. She was good at not asking questions. It had taken her 4 shifts to understand she was not inside a normal building. The armed men in the hallways were a clue. The way the cleaning staff moved around certain doors without ever touching the handles was another. The third clue was the name that moved through the building like low pressure before a storm. Not said loudly, not often, but felt in every room regardless. Falcone. She'd heard it twice before she saw him. Once from Deacon, the silver-haired man who had processed her hiring paperwork, and who watched her with the patient attention of someone paid to watch carefully, and once from a woman in the elevator who had gone completely silent mid-sentence when a shadow crossed the security camera in the corner. Darby had looked the name up when she got home that first morning. She didn't look it up again. The break room on the 14th floor was small and utilitarian. The coffee maker was expensive and perpetually burned. Darby didn't use it. She brought her own supplies in a cotton bag she carried everywhere, a tin of loose-leaf chamomile, a small bag of cardamom pods, a jar of dark honey she'd bought at a farmer's market 2 years ago and rationed like something irreplaceable. Every night at 3 in the morning, she made tea. It wasn't a choice so much as a biological instruction. Her mother had made the same tea when the bills got bad, which was often: steep it dark, crack the cardamom before it goes in, let the honey sink down slow. It was a way of telling her nervous system that the day was ending, even when it wasn't. She was standing over the electric kettle on her 7th night when she heard footsteps in the corridor that moved differently than the guards, heavier, unhurried, belonging to a man who owned every floor he walked across. Falcone appeared in the doorway. She had seen his photograph once when she'd made the mistake of running the search. The photograph hadn't prepared her for the physical reality. He was taller than she'd expected, with the particular build of someone who had done hard labor somewhere in his past and carried the residue of it in his shoulders. His face was a study in controlled exhaustion, jaw-set, hard, dark eyes carrying the specific heaviness of a person who had stopped sleeping but hadn't stopped needing to. He wore a dress shirt with the collar undone, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and there was a pale, clean-edged scar running from his wrist toward his elbow that she looked at once and then away from. He looked at the kettle, then at the chamomile tin, then at her. "You work nights," he said. "Not a question." "Accountant." She kept her voice steady, auditing the secondary ledgers. "Deacon hired me." "I know who you are." His eyes drifted back to the kettle. Something moved across his expression. Not warmth, but something that passed through the same neighborhood. "What is that?" "Tea." "What kind?" "Chamomile and cardamom." She measured a beat. "There's enough for 2 if you want." The silence that followed lasted long enough that she was certain he would leave. Men like Falcone did not accept things from women like her. They requisitioned things. They took things. They didn't stand in break rooms and accept offers of chamomile. He sat down at the far end of the table. She set a mug in front of him without ceremony. She didn't hover. She took her own mug and her ledger notebook to the other end of the table and went back to work as if nothing had happened. She heard him lift the mug. She heard him drink. She didn't look up. 40 minutes later, when she gathered her things to head back down the hall, she glanced toward his end of the table. Falcone had not moved. His arms were folded on the table surface, his cheek resting on his forearm, His breathing slowed to something deep and regular. He was asleep. Darby looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she turned off the overhead fluorescent light, leaving only the dull amber of the exit sign, and walked out quietly. The next evening, Deacon was waiting when she arrived. "Mr. Falcone would like your workstation moved to the 14th floor, he said. "My audit is of the 2nd floor accounts. The relevant accounts have been relocated upstairs." She considered asking why. She decided she'd rather not know. The new office was twice the size of her previous workstation and had a window. It was directly down the hall from the break room. She understood the arrangement within an hour. Falcone worked through the night in the corner office at the end of the corridor. He worked the way someone in a burning building works, with the focused, slightly manic efficiency of a person who knows they're running short on time. At 3 in the morning, she made tea. At 3:15, he appeared in the break room doorway. She filled 2 mugs without being asked. He sat at the far end of the table. She sat at hers. He didn't speak much. Neither did she. Once he said, "How long have you been making that?" And she said, "Since I was 19. And he said, "It works." And she said, "Usually," and that was the end of it. She didn't ask him why a man who ran the Eastern Seaboard was awake at 3 in the morning every night of the week. The books were already telling her what she needed to know. She could read it in the way he moved. A slight lag between intention and action, a fine tremor in the careful stillness he maintained. She'd seen the same quality in her mother near the end, that particular exhausted sediment that settles into a person's bones when the body has been fighting itself for too long. She could see it in the margin notes on the printed reports. Deacon brought him handwriting slightly less precise than it must have once been. An occasional correction that wouldn't have needed making 6 months ago. He was running an empire on fumes. Every person around him was too afraid to say so. Darby was not unafraid. She simply had a higher threshold for crisis than most. By the 2nd week, the 3 a.m. ritual had acquired the quiet weight of habit. She made tea. He came. She worked. He sat. Twice more he fell asleep at the table, and twice more she turned out the light and let him. She didn't find this strange. She found it practical. The man needed sleep. Her presence in a room with chamomile and low light was apparently providing it, and that was a fact she noted the same way she noted a corrected ledger entry. On a Friday in the 3rd week, buried in a stack of miscellaneous accounts, Deacon had passed along for reconciliation. She found it. The account number was familiar because she'd been sending checks to it for 14 months. Her mother's medical debt, transferred through a small collections firm to an entity 2 shell companies removed from Redmont Holdings. Darby sat very still. The debt wasn't hers. It had been her mother's. When her mother died, Darby had assumed responsibility for it because someone had to. She'd been making payments faithfully, budgeting around them, building her life in the negative space between what she owed and what she could earn. She had been paying the whole time into Falcone's organization. She did the math. 6,000 left on the balance. 3 months at her current salary. She thought about leaving. She thought about starting over somewhere else and stretching it to 9 months. She thought about what it would mean to start over again with nothing. She went back to work. She didn't bring it up until the following night's tea. He sat down across from her, and she let him settle for a moment, and then she said, "You know about the debt?" "Yes," he said. "Since before you hired me." "Before I approved your hire, yes." She let this land. "So I'm here because of a debt that wasn't mine to begin with." "You're here because you're the most accurate auditor I've had access to in 4 years." He looked at her steadily. The calculation in his eyes was something she'd learned to read by now. Not coldness, exactly, but the habit of precision. "The debt is how I found you. That's all." She turned back to her notebook. Her hands were very still. Inside, she was doing a different kind of math, the kind that had nothing to do with numbers. He told her once, near the end of the 3rd week, that he hadn't slept properly since February. He said it the way he said everything factual, flat informational, without inflection. "What happened in February?" she asked. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Something I thought I had prevented," he said. "I was wrong." She understood from his tone that this was the complete answer. Pushing further would cost her something she wasn't ready to spend. "It's the cardamom," she said instead. He looked at her. "That's what the smell connects to. It's why it works." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "My mother said cardamom slows the nervous system. She wasn't a doctor, but she said it like she knew." Falcone turned his mug slowly between his palms. "There was a kitchen, Brooklyn, when I was small." He said it quietly, more to himself than to her. "Someone who made it the same way. I had forgotten about that." "The ones that help are always the ones you forgot you had," Darby said. "The nervous system remembers even when the rest of you doesn't." He looked at her across the narrow table with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not gratitude, exactly, but something rawer than gratitude and less comfortable to carry. The threat announced itself on a Tuesday morning. She was signing out at the lobby desk when a small man in a grey coat stopped beside her. He didn't look at her directly. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "McCallan wants to know what you're doing for him," the man said. Her pen stopped on the sign-out sheet. "Tell McCallan he has the wrong person," she said. "He's been watching Falcone deteriorate for 8 months. 3 weeks ago something changed. Falcone's sharper, his reaction time is back, his pattern recognition is back." A pause. "McCallan doesn't believe in coincidences, and neither do I. He wants it to stop." He walked out through the glass doors without waiting for her answer. Darby finished signing her name. Her handwriting was steady. She went upstairs to the 14th floor instead of leaving. Deacon was already in the hallway. He looked at her face, read it, and said simply, "Come with me." Falcone listened to the full account without moving. When she finished, the office was quiet for a long time. "You came back upstairs," he said. "You'd have seen it on the camera footage regardless. I'd rather tell you myself." He looked at her for a moment, then at the window. "McCallan has been patient for 8 months. He thought the situation would resolve itself without him needing to intervene further." "Your insomnia wasn't just stress," she said, "was it?" "No." She didn't push. Some accounting was better left at the line item and not traced back to the source. "I need access to the offshore entity structure," she said. "You have 2 accounts that McCallan has direct sight lines into. If you consolidate them through the 3rd-tier Redmont entities before end of week, he loses the visibility. He'll know something moved, but he won't know where." The silence that followed had a different quality than the usual 3 a.m. silence. This one had weight. "You found that in the secondary ledgers," Falcone said. "The accounts were telling anyone who was reading them correctly." She met his eyes. "I was reading them correctly." He stood up from behind the desk and walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking at the city below, the bridges, the lights, the particular vastness of a place that didn't care who ran it. "The debt is cleared," he said, "as of today." She absorbed this. "I still have." "It's cleared, Stokes." She looked at his back. She thought about saying thank you. She said instead, "You can't just." "I can." He turned around. His expression was quieter now than she'd ever seen it, stripped of the calculation, the assessment, the architecture of authority he wore like a second set of bones. "I did." He held her gaze across the width of the office. "Stay on the Redmont account. Not because of McCallan. Not because of the debt." He stopped. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's afraid of losing before he's sure he ever had it. "Just stay." Darby looked at him, standing against the window with the city behind him, the scar on his forearm, the shadows under his eyes that were slightly less deep than they'd been 3 weeks ago. She thought about the ledger of the last month, what she'd owed, what she'd provided, what had passed between them in a break room at 3 in the morning, the particular intimacy of 2 people who were both, in their different ways, running on empty. Some things didn't balance. That was fine. Not everything was supposed to. She walked back to the leather chair across from his desk and sat down. She opened her notebook to a clean page. "I'll need the offshore entity access cleared by morning," she said, "and I want a lock on the break room door, a real one, not just a passkey." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, the first cousin of one. "Deacon will handle it," he said. He sat down across from her. She made a note in the margin. Outside, the city moved without them, enormous and indifferent. And in the 14th floor office of a building that ran on fear and careful arithmetic, two people who had been starving for different things settled into the particular quiet of people who have found, without meaning to, exactly what they needed.